Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a chat about a fascinating musical phenomenon, the concept of ownership. In other words, this performer is so identified with this particular repertoire that they own it. Kind of a silly notion when you think about it, but it happens. And the reasons that it happens are interesting. They're worth discussing, I think. You know, when I was starting out as a critic, writing for High Fidelity magazine in the early 80s, or the mid 80s, one of my editors, sort of toward the end of the magazine's existence, actually, I guess that must have been around 87, 86, 87, something like that, he said to me, "There are two words I never want to see in a review. One is unique, because, of course, every performance is unique in one way or another. So what good does it say to say that something's unique? And the other was definitive, because something is only definitive until someone else comes along and redefinitivizes it or redefines it in their own way. So there's no such thing as a definitive recording of anything either. There could be singleton recordings. You could have no choice. Or there could be a selection of fabulous recordings, which is what I try to do when I do these repertoire summaries, because you know, and I know, that there are a lot of good recordings of most pieces, you know, unless, like I said, there's only one, in which case we have no choice, and there's sometimes no way to tell if it's any good or not. But most of the time, there's a selection of splendid recordings which renders the word definitive completely, utterly, and totally useless. But with that said, I have said, I'm sure you have said, I've seen in these comments, so-and-so owns that piece. Well, all right. So perhaps they do. Let's talk about, I have 12 examples of performers who can be said to own a certain piece of repertoire stuff. And when I'm done, I will ask you to give me your guess or example or theory as to an artist I didn't mention who owns a work which I didn't mention, and explain why and what the theory is behind it. Because there are lots of different theories, and we're going to talk about them. So let's just get started. The first thing I want to talk about is the Pachelbel canon, because we just did a little talk on the Jean-François Paillard Chamber Orchestra's Bach. Now, of course, the Pachelbel canon, as one of you pointed out, was the horror of NPR pledge drives. It was give us money and we will not play the Pachelbel canon again. I lived through that. That was in the early 80s. And the absolute nadir was reached when RCA released a disc called Pachelbel's Greatest Hit, which had the actual version, because RCA and Arado had a relationship then. Arado was a separate label, and they had a licensing arrangement. So they had the version with the Jean-François Paillard Chamber Orchestra, conducted by Jean-François Paillard, which is it's a lovely arrangement. But the actual work apparently was an organ solo, or it was scored for like a couple violins and continuo, because I'll never forget when Reinhard Goebel and Musica Antigua Köln came out with their version of it, which was an authentic version, and it had the gigue attached to it. Because remember, it was canon and gigue. It was like prelude and fugue. It's actually a two-movement work. Jean-François Paillard was smart enough to leave the gigue off. So anyway, Reinhard Goebel did the original version, and everybody was pushing it. Oh, it's the authentic version, get it. All these people bought it, and they all returned it. I was working at a Tower Records back in those days, and it was hilarious. It was absolutely hilarious. They all got returned because it didn't sound anything like the Jean-François Paillard Chamber Orchestra, conducted by Jean-François Paillard. It was hysterical. But RCA had this disc, Pachelbel's Greatest Hit. So you had that version, the Paillard version, and then there were like 6 or 7 other versions of it. And some of those were really bizarre. There was the George Rochberg, string quartet version, which was kind of wild. Then there was Cleo Lane, who did a pop song where she sang, "Who, where, why, when will we touch again?" or something like that. It was sort of like a pop song arrangement of the Jean-Francois Paillard arrangement of the original. It was, oh my goodness, it was so weird. But they were trying to capitalize on the popularity of the piece. And it was Paillard who owned it. But of course, the only thing he really owned was his arrangement. Everybody else could do whatever else they wanted. And so they did. But that's one wonderful example of how you make a piece your own. What you do is you make a proprietary version of it, and then you get public radio to play the crap out of it during their pledge drives, and the whole world will take notice, for good or ill. Next, a piece that was owned formally, actually double owned, this is a twofer, was Vivaldi's The Four Seasons. I mean, remember how popular that became? Remember the movie with Alan Alda and Carol Burnett and all those people? I mean, it was actually a good movie. It was really kind of an enjoyable movie. But it was all based on Vivaldi. I mean, and of course, Vivaldi wrote, 7,000 trillion billion other concerti, which nobody paid any attention to at all. That was the funny thing about it, was that people who knew the Four Seasons by Vivaldi didn't think Vivaldi wrote anything else. They all thought he was like a one-shot wonder, even though the opus that this was part of actually had 8 more concertos in it. Nobody knew that either. But there were 2 versions of the Four Seasons which defined the work and the group which played it. And this was, of course, before the period instrument people got their fangs into it. And even when they did, it didn't matter. The Four Seasons was so popular, it even survived period instrument performance for quite some time. If you lived in continental Europe, basically, then your Four Seasons was played by I Musici, one of the 50 or 60 versions that they made. And now that there's an 83 CD box of I Musici coming, we will be able to see at least 2 or 3 or 4 of those Four Seasons. Presumably, this is only analog recordings, so the digital ones may not show up. And there were some of those too. But the Four Seasons by I Musici was the continental Europe version, or if in America, if you had access to imports. If you lived in the UK or the United States, I mean, that was the English-speaking axis, as it were, then it was Neville Marriner with the Academy of St. Martin in the Fields. Obviously, it had to be Neville Marriner with the Academy of St. Martin in the Fields. And again, people who had no clue what Vivaldi was or what classical music was, they knew Neville Marriner and the Academy of St. Martin in the Fields because of their recording of the Four Seasons, which was simply played to death, again, on the radio. I mean, that's how people found these things, and then they wandered into whatever local record emporium existed in those days, and you could find it, because even though there were many, many, many other versions, you couldn't sell them. It's really the point I want to make about it. It's really very interesting. How many versions was there room for in your average record bin? And even if you could fit 56 versions of the Four Seasons in your record bin, why would you bother when you could sell a ton of I Musici or Neville Marriner and you didn't have to bother with any of those other ones? It was only when CDs came out, things got like smaller and more compact, that you could start having other versions. And digital recording was a reason to do more, and then period instruments was a reason to do more. All of these reasons to do more. Did they actually sell more? Oh, I don't know. There were some period versions that did extremely well. Hogwoods, when that first came out. And, those people, they did the Four Seasons. Of course, it's one of the first things they did because it was so popular. And they sold a lot of them. There's no question, as the authentic version. It was Harnoncourt's Dementivo, the Dr. Demented Harnoncourt version. Boy, was that strange. But no, essentially it was I Musici and Marriner, and that's what put the piece on the map. And they owned the Four Seasons. Next, a keyboard work. Albeniz, Iberia, and you know who owned that. It was Alicia de la Rocha, who recorded it at least 3 times, initially for Spanish Hispavox, which was on EMI, and most people in the rest of the world had no idea that that recording existed. Some people think it's her best one because she was young and full of fire, and it was, perhaps the most impulsive and virtuosic of them all. Then she made her standard Decca version in analog sound, which was quite lovely. And then she remade it again for Decca digitally, which by general consensus is the least interesting of the 3. I'm not sure that's true. I think there's an interesting issue to address there, which is simply how many times can the same person do the same thing and have people care? It's much easier, of course, to prefer the one that you already know and to not spend a lot of time and attention with the one that you don't know, the newer one. And so, it's a question of swings and roundabouts. De la Rocha was a fabulous artist, and she certainly knew that music. And did she own it? Well, for people outside of Spain, she did. And for people who are not piano crazies, she did. Because, piano crazies are always looking for that super duper uber special version by the incredibly obscure so-and-so that no one else has heard of, so that they can claim that they have a proprietary extrasensory perception of who the greatest really is and what real greatness is, because real greatness can never be appreciated by anyone other than themselves and maybe 2 or 3 people close to them. But the rest of the world is all just, inartistic and horrible. And, piano people are like that. Violin people are like that too, but not to the same extent. Now, the version that the piano people tended to go for, which they said just wiped De la Rocha off the face of the earth, was Esteban Sanchez on Ensayo, playing a really grotty, sort of out-of-tune piano. And it's a wonderful Iberia. I love it. I heard it. I think it's marvelous. Cranky piano and all. It's wonderful. Is it better than De La Rocha? No. It's unique. It's just different. It's a very, very fine performance. But that was sort of the cult Iberia. And everyone said that Sanchez owned Iberia, except that nobody knew it. That's the problem with these cult people, is that, yes, they have their gods and goddesses, but no one knows who they are, and nobody agrees with who they are. So, that's an issue. But De La Rocha was the Iberia lady. When you thought about Iberia, you thought De La Rocha. It was also true of Goyescas by Granados and a lot of other things by Spanish piano composers. She owned that repertoire, more or less. And actually, since she passed away, it has really only been since she passed away that we began to realize that there are many other fine performers of Iberia. Really quite a few. And there's also a lot of really great Spanish music that she didn't play. And it's all getting recorded or got recorded, because she wasn't sort of, diminutive, sweet little, she wasn't always that sweet, but she was a diminutive lady, who sort of muscled her way into the, into the assembly line of Spanish piano recordings and took over the whole thing. If it didn't have her name on it and it was Spanish, nobody would take a risk. Once she was gone, it didn't matter whose name was on it because nobody was buying anything. And so the artists were just paying to produce the records. So that's what happened with Iberia. Next, some more piano stuff. Debussy piano works with Walter Gieseking. Now, Gieseking was a fascinating character, a genuine fun-filled Nazi who actually, made his career loving French music. And that was so odd for someone in his particular milieu, being, living through the Third Reich, being popular with the authorities there, and being a Debussy specialist, a French piano music specialist. That was really weird. And that has to be one of the reasons why Gieseking's Debussy was so admired, because people figured, hey, this unregenerate Nazi can do a great job with Debussy and play it for party officials throughout the Second World War, whatever he did, it had to be special. Because what sane German person plays Debussy? I mean, you didn't see, what's his name, Backhouse or Kempf or all those people running around doing Debussy preludes everywhere. I mean, they played some Debussy. Everybody played some Debussy. But Gieseking specialized in Debussy. Of course, again, it's another one of those circumstances where people just parrot received opinion. After Gieseking died and everyone else was doing Debussy, it was always, Gieseking, the incomparable Gieseking. Well, it turns out that if you listened carefully, Gieseking was very comparable. He really was. And he was kind of, but it took a lot. It took a lot to shove him aside. What really did it was Arturo Benedetti Michelangeli. Because when his DG recordings of the Debussy preludes and other pieces came out, everyone just was aghast. They just went, we didn't know it could be played that way. Well, the truth is a lot of people have been playing it better than Gieseking and in much better sound. But nobody was listening. One of the ways that an artist learns how to own a piece of repertoire is simply through inertia. Not inertia, inertia. Inertia. Yes, just inertia, because people would rather talk about it than listen to it. And people would rather assume that the people who have told them that this is the greatest one are right and this is the greatest one, so nothing else is going to be comparable. So not only do you not have to listen to the supposedly greatest one, to the owner person, but you don't have to listen to anything that comes along to challenge it either. But Michelangeli did that. And that was quite an achievement to shake up the piano world to the degree where Gieseking was basically knocked off his pedestal at long last. And of course, since then, there have been countless fantastic recordings of Debussy's piano music. Choose the work, and you've got a stack like this. That's what's so, once you shake the fruit loose from the tree, it's gone. And no one is ever going to have the same view that they did formerly. I think that's, one of those facts about artistic ownership. So after Debussy, oh my goodness, here it comes. Are you ready? We have to deal with the ninth and Furtwangler. Yes, Furtwangler's recording of the ninth, or actually several of them. Now, Furtwangler only could be said to own that work because of political reasons. It had nothing to do with music, nothing to do with artistry, nothing to do with interpretive excellence or vision or imagination or any of those things. I'm not saying he didn't do great recordings occasionally or great performances once in a blue moon. He did. And that Lucerne version, the last one, is just tremendous. He had a truly individual conception of the work, but we're talking about ownership. And what gave him ownership was that famous 1942 Nazi broadcast, whatever the heck it was, with, Hitler and his friends not in the audience, or maybe in the audience, or a bunch of Nazis in the audience, whatever it was because he played it for the Nazis. And because he played it for the Nazis, despite the fact that it is the most awful performance that he ever gave of that work, recorded in possibly the most miserable sound he ever received, everyone establishes his right of ownership because they feel the tension. It was a performance of extraordinary tension, of histrionic hysteria, because he was nervous, because he didn't like those Nazis, and he knew that they were debasing German culture, and therefore his performance of the ninth was intended to be a rebuke somehow, some way. He either was rebuking them by playing it horribly, or rebuking them by playing it so intensely that maybe he was hoping they would all just drop dead when it was over. Well, the only thing that remained was the fact that it was horrible. They didn't drop dead when it was over. So Furtwangler's ownership of the work was entirely and completely based on non-musical criteria. criteria. Totally. And the evidence is simple. It's because the best recording he ever made of it isn't the one that establishes his right of ownership. It's the worst recording he ever made of it. So there's that one. Next. Oh, yeah. Bach, Sonatas and Partitas. Nathan Milstein. Before Nathan Milstein, there were many recordings of the Bach sonatas and partitas. I mean, you had Grumio. I mean, Heifetz did them. Everybody was doing them. You know, all violinists worth their salt. Even Johanna Marzi did them. Everybody did them. But nobody had ownership of them until Milstein. Now, Milstein had done them previously, too. He did them originally for EMI, but they were older recordings. And when he started recording for Deutsche Grammophon, he made very, very few records. It's worth pointing out. He did the Brahms Concerto, the Mendelssohn, and the Tchaikovsky, and these Bach sonatas and partitas. That was about it. And so there was value in scarcity, number one. And by the time he came to make them, he was one of the last surviving students, or maybe he was the last surviving student, of Leopold Auer, the great Russian violin pedagogue. And so people all of a sudden woke up and realized that there was this grand old man of the violin with this unbelievable pedigree going back to the early mists of time. And then he did Bach. And he did them superbly well. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. It's a fantastic, fantastic performance of the sonatas and partitas. But they were the right thing at the right place with the right guy. Again, it was a question of the historical circumstance. But in this case, unlike with Furtwangler, the musical substance was commensurate with the importance of the artist and the occasion and his history. Everything was consistent, and everything was done to the greater glory of Bach and his music. Nobody could say that Milstein was taking advantage of anything recording those works. He was just making supremely fine music. And so he came gradually, at least for a few years, to, of course, be considered the reference version in the Bach sonatas and partitas. He owned them. But since he passed away, of course, because every violinist in the world had to record them, it was inevitable that his pride of ownership was not going to last all that long, because everyone and their mother was going to do another version of them. And that's exactly what happened. And many of them are superb. And they're so good, quite frankly, that it's virtually impossible now to tell them apart. You know, it's not that they all sound alike, it's just that they're all equally excellent in their own way. And so the idea of anyone ever establishing ownership again over this repertoire is virtually impossible to even contemplate. I don't see how that could ever happen. So after that, let's see, what do we have here? Let me just roll this up a little bit. Oh, yeah, I have a dozen of these, by the way. If you're getting bored, you can come back later or just, turn it off. Delius, Thomas Beecham. Beecham's Delius was one of the great marvels of the 20th century. Now, that was some fascinating partnership, a symbiosis, if ever there was one, because no one else was interested in doing Delius. And Beecham was such a genius as a conductor that he made sure that nobody could ever do it better. I mean, he played from his own scores. He edited all of them, for performance. And he did everything Delius wrote practically. I mean, he played a lot of it and constantly. He kept it before the public eye, and by sheer force of will convinced everybody that there was really something there. And there really is. Delius is an extraordinarily unique composer. He had a very, very personal vision. And it was rather interesting that Thomas Beecham chose him because, and this is something that people don't often remark, but, Beecham was known for being, a great aficionado of light music and quick music and French music and fluffy music and exciting music and, vulgar showpieces and, minor works by other composers like the Lalo Symphony. And, he was not your typical, standard German classics guy, nor was he your typical take everything seriously guy. So he found in Delius somebody whose music was basically slow and inward and contemplative and nature-oriented. And it was really a masterstroke of Beecham to champion Delius because it gave him the perception of depth that he otherwise, I don't think, would have acquired any other way. And it was a perception of depth in contemporary music that nobody else was doing or heard of. So he got lots of points for championing Delius, even for people who didn't even like Delius. It's a fascinating case study in what they did for each other. Because I really believe that Delius gave Beecham a very, very important professional certification, stamp of legitimacy as a serious artist. Whereas, running around doing nothing but, French stuff and Strauss stuff and L'Arlésienne and Scheherazade, that wasn't going to get you there. Was not going to get you there. So that's a fascinating case of how ownership worked both ways. It really did. So after that, we have, this is a must, right? Knappertsbusch doing Parsifal. That is a fabulously interesting case of ownership. Knappertsbusch, as we've all discovered from the two recent eloquence boxes, was a rather hapless conductor in virtually any other music but Wagner, and sometimes even in Wagner. But Parsifal was his thing. And it was so much his thing that at Bayreuth, the shrine of Wagner, they let him have it. He owned Parsifal at Bayreuth and, made a dozen existing recordings of him playing Parsifal at Bayreuth. I mean, that's what he did. And he never seemed to get bored with it. I think it's just unbelievably fascinating. Either that or no one could tell the difference, because his conducting style was basically so haphazard that whether he was awake or asleep or alert or not alert or on drugs or on tranquilizers, it didn't make any difference. It all came out sounding the same. Now, his Parsifal was not especially slow, at least compared to someone like Reginald Goodall, who owned nothing, by the way, and I mean nothing. Zippo. It was just one of those forces of nature type things. And the Knappertsbusch Parsifal phenomenon was such an institution throughout the 50s and early 60s. It was just his. And it's remarkable. Now, of course, Parsifal is not an opera that is ever going to be really popular. Lots of people dislike it. I loathe it personally, as I'm sure you know, because I've only said it 100 times. But I acknowledge the greatness of Knappertsbusch's interpretations of it. He was a fabulous Parsifalian. He really was. It was just something that clicked with him. And I think it could also be that because he seemed so helpless and lackadaisical and uncaring in almost anything else he conducted that wasn't Wagner, that the fact that this Parsifal was so excellent was a certain confirmation, a sneaking confirmation that, well, maybe there was greatness in the man after all. Maybe he was better than we all thought. He wasn't better. He just was really good at Parsifal. Everybody has one thing they do well, and this was his. So there you go. Next, the Elgar Cello Concerto with Jacqueline Dupre and Barbaroli. Oh, my goodness. I don't particularly care for that performance, but then I don't particularly care for the work. So I like performances that are a lot less self-indulgent. I tend to prefer leaner and swifter versions, but it doesn't make any difference. That's not the point. Dupre's fame and ownership of the Elgar Cello Concerto rests on two things, one musical, one not musical. But of course, they're impossible to untangle. The musical thing, of course, is the excellence of the interpretation and the performance, which I freely acknowledge. I truly do. The non-musical thing is the fact that she had a tragic life and died young, just like Kathleen Ferrier. And we all know there's nothing the English like more than some sort of horrifying tragedy to befall a young artist, particularly females. Especially females. It's what you might call the Madame Butterfly syndrome. where Puccini had to take these cute little girls and torture them to death horribly in all of his operas. That's basically the plot. She loves, she dies. Well, that was Jacqueline du Pré. It was the plot of a Puccini opera in real life. She loved music, she lived for music, and she died. And she died horribly, and she died of multiple sclerosis. And believe you me, I have sympathy for that because I have multiple sclerosis. And I don't have it like she had it, but it's enough. Trust me, it's enough. So, her life was definitely the stuff of myth. And that myth became part of what established her ownership of the Elgar Cello Concerto. It not just the fact that she died young, but the fact that because she died young, her discography was limited. And so the truly outstanding recordings are very few. And that makes each one more precious because there's value in scarcity, as I keep trying to tell people in the classical music industry as they're recording the 400 trillionth bolero. But they don't believe it because they think that their 400 trillionth version is unique. And it isn't. It's just the 412 trillionth version of bolero. And yeah, okay, it's unique. Yeah, right. Okay, for all that means. But the du Pré Elgar Cello Concerto, it is unique. Absolutely, absolutely unique with a great conductor. And it's just a love fest of a performance. And you can hear it. You can hear it very, very plainly. Some people can't get enough of it. And some people can't stand it, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether they like it or not. The issue of ownership has nothing to do with personal preference. I freely acknowledge whether I liked the performance or not. She owned it. It was hers for all of the reasons just enumerated. So next, we have 3 more to go. Hang in there, folks. This is the piano solo equivalent of the Jacqueline du Pré phenomenon. It's Dino Lipatti's Chopin waltzes. Now, Lipatti, of course, was an astonishingly brilliant pianist, a tremendously soulful musician. He passed away way too young from leukemia, and he made very few recordings. And very few substantial recordings. I mean, there are a couple concertos. There's the usual recitals of bits and pieces of things. But the Chopin waltzes are really sort of his biggest complete set of something. And of something in a composer in which he was acknowledged as one of the absolutely supreme exponents. So that makes them 1,000 times more valuable than they might otherwise have been. And even in Lipatti's day, there were great players performing the Chopin waltzes, although not so many complete sets, I don't think. But, when Rubinstein came and did them in stereo, it came a little bit later. After that, 1 billion people did the Chopin waltzes. But everybody acknowledges that this is one of the supreme pianistic achievements in Chopin's music and the reference recording for the waltzes. And unlike Walter Gieseking, it has remained so. And not because I don't think Lipatti died young. I just think because it's musically so fabulous that you'd have to be on drugs not to acknowledge it. Sometimes the music does win out. It does. It makes me hopeful for the future of humanity because, yeah, there are some recordings that are just so musically stupendous that they silence criticism. And this is one of them. It's plainly one of them. So there's that. Next, the Beethoven Fifth, with you-know-who, Carlos Kleiber. Now, we've had a lot of discussion about this performance, haven't we? Back and forth, because I've acknowledged that it's an excellent performance, but it's not one of my favorites. I don't find it emotionally terribly involving, but it is unquestionably a fabulously played and interpreted performance. It's his vision of the work, 100%. He gets the orchestra to knock it out of the park. He really does. And for how many years, even now, even today, it's still a reference. When people talked about Beethoven's Fifth, when I was growing up, from the day that recording was issued, all they talked about was, well, of course, there's Kleiber. And I think one of the things that really contributed to Kleiber's ownership of the Beethoven Fifth was, again, it's a question of scarcity. It's a question of the fact that he wasn't recording it every 15 minutes, that there were, He didn't even record a Beethoven cycle. There were only a few recordings of anything that he did. But even in Beethoven, he was selective. Now, do you know what it means to be selective from a minority position? In other words, there are only 9 symphonies, so there's not a lot of them. Every one of them is acknowledged a masterpiece. Everybody wants to do cycles. They all fit on 5 CDs. And to have Kleiber say, I'm just doing the 5th and the 7th. I mean, later, other things popped up, the 4th and some, we know. But essentially, for Deutsche Grammophon, on 1 CD or on 2 LPs, he said, I'm just doing 2 of them. And to hell with the rest. Because those 2 are the ones that are the most worthy of my attention. Well, isn't that a statement, isn't it? I mean, assuming that a bolt of lightning doesn't come down and zap him instantaneously, it's an extraordinary statement. And so I think his recording of the 5th was held in the kind of reverence that the full pretension behind it demonstrated. You always have to ask yourself, how many people really, really listen to it? Really listen to it comparatively and well? And, I don't think, frankly, all that many. It was just so easy to point to that 5th. It's the Kleiber 5th, damn it. And nothing else is comparable. Well, yeah, a lot of things are comparable. A lot of things are better, in my view. But it didn't matter. He owned it. He owned it because of the Deutsche Grammophon's marketing, because of his self-promotion, because of all of those ways of making what you do valuable. And he knew how. He knew how to make his stuff valuable. All he had to do was not conduct. And he became valuable. He piggybacked on his father's reputation, first of all. And his father's Beethoven's 5th, I think, is better as well. But he piggybacked on his dad's reputation, and from there on, all he had to do was use his name and not conduct. Really quite an astonishing career. However, there is one example of ownership that I think reduces all of the others, that diminishes every other example I've mentioned. And that is the Callas Traviata. Because there is a woman who owned a role that she never sang at the height of her career in a recorded situation. I'm not saying she never sang it. Remember, she made one early studio recording, the early one on Cetra or whatever it was on, which everybody unilaterally dismisses. I mean, it's not terribly well recorded, but it's better recorded than the horrible live ones, the Lisbon one or that Jellini one, the other one from wherever it was from, La Scala or whatever, Mexico City. Who knows? But the amazing thing about Maria Callas is that her Traviata is owned because you can't hear it. You can barely hear it. They sound so awful. Those performances are so crappy. But she gets it anyway on the basis of her artistry with other music. People figure, oh, wow, she was such a great artist. So amazing, so unbelievably intelligent, so emotionally sophisticated, so full of depth. And because her own life was miserable, full of suffering and pain and anguish and tsuris and everything that you could have, that had she done one in really great sound or in decent sound or tolerable sound, it would have been the greatest Violetta ever in the history of humanity. And the fact that she never quite did it doesn't change that one bit. And the genius of Callas's ownership of Traviata is the fact that there's no way to disprove the fact that she owns it because she never sang it. We can't hear that she would have owned the Traviata. I know. They're opera, like piano crazies. They're opera crazies. And the opera crazies will say, oh, yes, you can hear the voice in the Lisbon Traviata. You can hear this and that and one of those things. You can hear something or other. You hear someone going, You can hear that. That's what it sounds like. It sounds just horrible. It's absolutely awful. But people imagine, I think, that they can actually hear what's going on there, and that it actually transmits somehow through the static and the dynamic compression and the distance and the audience noise and the dropouts and all of that stuff. Somehow the true, authentic, indefinable, impermeable, indefensible pain and anguish of Violetta Valéry is transmitted through the voice of Callas down through the ages and into the sleeve of the guy with the microphone and the tape player on the night, and it all just transmits. And she owns La Traviata. It's an extraordinary musical phenomenon in my view, and one that proves to me, as is the case with Furtwangler, quite frankly, that people hear what they want to hear, irrespective of what's actually there. And let me tell you something, nothing is necessarily wrong with that. People have a right to be entertained however they feel like they want to be entertained. And they have a right to hear what they want to hear and feel what they want to feel for whatever reason they want to feel it. I mean, the fact that I don't, that's on me. It's not their fault. It's not because they're wrong or they're doing something inappropriate. I mean, I do think it's nice that, that musical judgments should be based on musical facts. That should be based on your ability to actually hear the music. But, at the end of the day, you can't criticize somebody for just liking something. I mean, it's not a crime to love something, to like something, to feel passionately about something. None of those things are wrong. They aren't. But if you just take a step back and look at the sociological phenomenon that it represents, these ownership examples, they are rather interesting. And I am fascinated by the cognitive dissonance, if you want to call it, between the love of music and the lack of actually listening to it, on which that love is based. For me, I don't get it. That's my shortcoming as a listener and as a person, I suppose. But I really think that these examples do tell us something very, very interesting. And now that this talk has gone on way longer than it had any right to, I ask you to give me an example of an artist that owns a work. And just a few lines, not a disquisition, not a doctoral dissertation, a few lines on why that's so and what you think it means. I'm awfully curious to see what your selections are. So thank you for joining me for this little chat. Keep on listening. I look forward to your thoughts. Take care.